Okay, so it falls to me great pleasure to introduce Professor Cameron Hepburn to give one of the plenary speeches for the conference. It's a great pleasure on many levels. One is, and I was going to explain Cameron a little bit to the geography audience by saying, look at what he did as an undergraduate. He did engineering. Wow, my God, he knows how to make things. And I think actually knowing how to make things is pretty important if you're going to really understand the nuts and bolts of the global economy, and better still, understand how those nuts and bolts work with and connect with environmental systems. Now, I'm not saying that all engineers are like that, but I'm saying that that mentality, how to think about things, is a really important mentality and something that this audience, I think, would naturally understand. The second element to his undergraduate career was, of course, doing law. Hold on, he's doing regulation of engineers. I thought that for a while, but clearly understanding the regulatory system, understanding the principles of the law, statute and otherwise, really useful. If you understand how to make things, nuts and bolts, and if you know something about how you might regulate the people who make nuts and bolts, actually you've got the rudiments now for a framework of affecting the real economy. And I think that's also an important ingredient, I think, in anybody who's seeking to make a big difference to how we think about the environment, how we think about climate change, and how we would go about actually changing the trajectories of whole economies over the next 25 to 35 years. Obviously, we can't wait for the economy to change by itself. God knows what direction it would go. But clearly we have to be part of that process of engineering a future, if I could use a phrase. He's going to say enough of the engineering metaphor. Cameron also did an M.Phil and Ph.D. in economics at Oxford, supervised by Dieter Helm. Well, more or less. Well, of course, that is always a debated question, but nonetheless influenced by Dieter amongst others. And I do think that people like Dieter Helm, vocal, aggressive, got a view about energy and how we might work in energy markets and energy sources, also an important ingredient in how you think about the world. Last point to make about Cameron's work. Cameron works in environmental economics. He's also working in areas that intersect from environmental economics to mainstream economics. And I think it's fundamental, looking to the future, that actually the issues were so important on climate change become the bread and butter of whole disciplines, become what you would obviously study. And I think we can see that emerging in economic geography. I think we can see that obviously deeply embedded in the geographical tradition, but it is now coming to start to play in a way that's really important for humanity. So, not to say that humanity is his responsibility directly, but today and tonight he's going to talk about green growth, models and metrics, and you're going to speak for about 35 minutes, 40, then take questions, and I promised we'd be out of here for drinks at 7 o'clock. Okay, so without any further ado, welcome Cameron, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you very much indeed, Gordon. I've never been introduced as a regulator of nuts and bolts. I quite like the phrase. I might use it again. And one of the pleasures for me of this conference is seeing that my colleagues are not just very nice people, they're not just intellectually very smart, but goodness me, can they organise an event. Congratulations, Darek, Patrizia, Gordon, the whole Oxford team on what a fine event it already is and will continue to be. So it's a delight to share with you some of our research in this space, and I say our advisedly. Specifically, this is coming out of a chapter for the handbook, the New Oxford Handbook on Economic Geography, joint with Alex Pfeiffer and Alex Tietelboim, two of the talented young researchers in the team. And the team is a growing one. We are working on questions of wealth, questions of green growth, climate change, energy transitions, biodiversity, fisheries, the whole gamut of issues relating to economics of sustainability. And so this is a subsection of the fun things that we do, and I wanted to share with you some of our thinking in 4 parts. So firstly, a bit of a reflection on the biggest of big debates, in my view at least, within the field of economic growth. Of course, there are many, many debates about and within economic growth, but the biggest one is what's the potential, for me at least, what's the potential for this machine that we have started to keep on going? Or will it undermine itself? You know, how that debate resolves itself is not just merely an intellectual curiosum. It has rather substantial implications for us all. So I'm going to address that. Then talk about some of the work we've been doing with some of the numbers on natural capital and the environmental constraints that we face. I'll be a bit provocative there. I think that some of the things we worry about are not actually issues at all, and we should be focusing on other things, I'll say so. Then we'll review what classic economic theory tells us about green growth. That'll be a fairly short section. It's decades of work, but I think it can be boiled down into a few key ideas. And then get our hands a bit messier and see what we can learn from the regulation of nuts and bolts in a policy section on green growth. So that's the structure, and let's see how we go. I also potentially have a game, depending on your appetite and my time to play. All right, so let's go back a little bit in history, not too far. Not as far as Malthus, but as far as John Stuart Mill. So Mill, in Principles of Political Economy in 1848, said, "I sincerely hope for the sake of posterity that they will be content to be stationary long before necessity compel them to it." So Mill's idea is that with ever-increasing material throughput on Earth, we were going to start to bump up against some limits, and we needed to stop focusing on scurrying around with, as he called it, the art of getting on, and instead focus on the art of living. And this kind of theme kind of trickles through economic thinking over the last couple of hundred years, and in particular recently, Keynes, Hicks, Tinbergen, all famous or Nobel laureates within economics. And the broad message that you can take out of most of this literature is that at some point we're going to hit a wall. We may want to slow this machine down, or it may do it of its own accord. And you can interpret, these texts in different ways, obviously. But one of the things I'm going to contend, and contend also about the more modern day variants of this idea, Tim Jackson's prosperity without growth. What I'm going to contend is that actually the view that zero economic growth is either necessary or desirable is incorrect. On the contrary, zero growth is undesirable, and it's undesirable for a few reasons. Firstly, if we're going to solve the environmental challenges that we have in front of us, we're not going to do it without substantial innovation. And innovation means continued thinking, continued doing, and continued growth. It's a lot easier to decouple emissions from, for instance, greenhouse gases from GDP if we're in a growing economy where people have some surplus capital to invest in thinking and to solving challenges. Secondly, if you think about solving many of these problems, whether it's biodiversity, fisheries, climate, etc., the most expensive way of solving all of them is to hammer the economy. You can look at kind of abatement costs, do boring standard, engineering nuts and boltsy economic sort of stuff, and find out that actually scaling back GDP costs you 10, 100 times as much as coming up with clever ideas to do things in a cleaner way. And finally, the idea that we should kind of stop economic growth really ignores the fact that there are still 1 billion people around the world, roughly speaking, living in fairly substantial poverty. It's just not ethical to suggest that a big chunk of the world's population doesn't have the right to improve their standards of living. So where does that leave us? It's a bold claim in some ways. I'm not necessarily saying all of these great thinkers are wrong. You can reinterpret them to be consistent with what I've just said for the most part. But does it leave us thinking that we need to just press on with business as usual, economic growth? Well, no is the obvious answer. So let's have a look at some of the environmental constraints that are hitting us and some of the environmental constraints that perhaps aren't constraints. Let me start with a bit of a definition. So I'm going to frame this within the context of the ideas of natural capital, contested set of ideas, but a very useful, it's certainly in the policy world, very useful set of ideas. And I'm going to divide natural capital up into two parts: renewable natural capital and exhaustible natural capital. Exhaustible are the minerals, coal, oil and gas, etc. Renewables are the sort of, green, fuzzy things, the ecosystems, biodiversity, etc. And we've had, again, long-running debates, even bets, about whether we are going to be in trouble over natural capital. Are we going to run out of our exhaustible resources? The most famous of these is between Julian Simon and Paul Ehrlich, both shown up there. I'm sure you know about the bet. There's been, I think, a film, certainly a book, written about this particular bet, but they had a bet about a basket of commodities. The idea was, Ehrlich's view was that we were rapidly running out of things. Simon, as an eternal optimist, we weren't running out of anything. They took, the way of framing this was to think about the price of a bundle of commodities. If we were running out of stuff, prices would be going up. If we weren't, they would be going down. So they took a bet over 10 years' time, and it was made in 1980, and by 1990, commodity prices has collapsed, and Simon won the bet. Now, a lot of economists kind of stop there and say, so you see, there's nothing to worry about here. Simon won the bet. We don't have a problem. But of course, that's just a snapshot in time. 10 years is not very long, geologically speaking. It's not even very long in the context of human civilization. And you can shuffle that 10-year period around and find that Ehrlich might have won, or Simon might have won at different points in time. Effectively, I don't think the bet tells us all that much, despite its fame and despite the kind of implications that are imputed to it. So I thought, how can we think about this in a little bit more, with a bit more rigor? And so the team, motivated partly by recent revivals of these concerns, the Club of Rome had its 33rd report last year, extinction, exhaustion, very big problems, etc. So we had a look at some data, God forbid, just to explore these ideas that you see everywhere. Peak everything, 8 things we're running out of and why. And so we looked at the United States Geological Survey data, and we looked at the base of reserves, and we looked at current production, and we projected production out into the future. And goodness, doesn't look so good. You look at nickel, tin, gold, copper, silver, and a bunch of metals, we're going to run out of them within 10 to 30 years. So an initial first pass analysis says this is a problem. And that's exactly the analysis that everyone's been doing. This is a problem. But let's push a little bit harder on this analysis, because that's frankly not very sophisticated. Let's go back in time and ask ourselves, what would those forecasts using the same methodology have looked like had we made them in 1956 when the data series starts, if you are willing to go back and get lots of individual bits of paper and code them and so on, which we've done. And let's make the same forecasts if I can get this, yeah, can you see the mouse? So the x-axis, horizontal axis here is the year in which the forecast is made. The vertical axis is the year in which people think we're going to run out of everything. Make sense? A few nods. So if we are running out of things, you should see something like this, because the date of exhaustion of the minerals will be coming into the present. So as time passes, if we're producing, extracting more and more resources and not replacing them, you'd expect something like that. If production is static and reserves are static, then we're going to run out of stuff. The date of the forecast date of exhaustion isn't moving, but we're still in a bit of a pickle because time rolls on and the forecast date doesn't roll on. And if we are replacing production with an allowance for additional growth every year, you'd get this kind of 1-to-1 ratio, something like that. So we've dug, we've analysed, we've done the numbers, and here they are for the top 10 minerals that are closest to exhaustion. And as you can see there, they broadly follow this pattern of us replacing just as much as we would need as each year rolls by. So for every year of additional production, we have at least another year's worth of reserves in the base to satisfy our demand. Now, as Gordon said, I once was an engineer. I understand how infiniteness and finiteness don't necessarily go together. So I do get the point that if you have infinite economic growth and infinite use of these resources, at some point you're going to exhaust the 70 kilometres of the lithosphere from which we extract these minerals. But what point is that? I also understand exponential growth, but I think that point is quite a long way away, and humanity is probably going to wipe itself out through some other reason before we hit these kind of resource limits. So the first conclusion I want you to take away is actually a fairly positive one. Of course, it's going to get more expensive, a bit more difficult to extract resources, but we are not actually really running out of anything. So this is a biased selection. It's the 10 minerals we are most likely to run out of. Okay, there's a whole lot of other ones, but these are the ones we should be worried about. So I think we're okay on that front. And an interesting question to ask is, well, why is it working this way? And an economist says, well, it's all very obvious. You have prices rise, there's substitution effects. Copper wire becomes replaced by fibre optic. Clever engineers go out and find more of these minerals. But it is actually an interesting question to me, why it is that these trends, these forces seem to balance so perfectly. So we're going to be seeing what we can say about that question in the coming months. Okay, so don't worry about minerals. Don't worry about oil, coal, and gas either. I haven't shown them. But in contrast, do worry about some other things. Let me go back to the division. It's the renewable natural capital that turns out to be problematic once you actually look fairly hard at the data. So let's have a bit of a look there. It's not quite as easy as just using reserves and resources estimates from the Geological Survey. Let's start with biodiversity. This is one of the best studies. It's a 2010 study in Science. You can see there in panel A the state of biodiversity over time. It's an aggregate of 31 different indicators. They're largely all falling. Certainly the aggregate is falling. So in short, we are losing our species. If you didn't already know, wake up. And that is because the pressures on biodiversity are rising. Again, perhaps unsurprising, but perhaps what might be interesting to you is that the policy response has increased markedly. So we are actually trying quite hard to, or at least we appear to be trying quite hard to stem the loss of species. But it's obviously nowhere near hard enough. We're not, and actually one of the things that we found when we looked into this fairly recently is that the state of research in this space is actually fairly poor, I hate to say. We don't really know what works and what doesn't work and why it works within the economics and policy of biodiversity. There are some limited studies that are very, very good, outstanding in fact, but quite a lot of the literature is just fairly dubious. Now, I would love to go on, but when I hit down, nothing happens. So, I can go on, but I could also probably use with a bit of tech assistance here. Oh, hello. Let me see if I can go on now. Thank you, well done. That was very, very smooth. I don't know what you did, but it was very classy. Okay, so we need more scholarship on biodiversity. And actually, I'd like to share with you a little story here. The last point here is that policy should be made to be evaluated. It's a fairly simple idea, that when governments put policies into place, they're designed so that after you've seen the effects of the policy, you can compare with a counterfactual and say, well, that worked and that didn't, this bit worked, that bit didn't. It's kind of science-ish. I suggested that once to the Secretary of State. I won't say which one, there have been quite a few, in energy over the last few years. And he thought it was an outstanding idea. And I thought, goodness me, we might make some serious progress here. If we have a Secretary of State in the Cabinet who has the idea that policy should be made to be evaluated with proper controls and treatment effects and so on, we could really learn something. But then one of his special advisors spoke up and said, Secretary, I think that would be quite courageous. I'm not sure that was the exact word he used, but because if we did that, the public would know whether or not our policies were working. Ah, I see the point, he said. And that was it. That was that idea. So there's quite a lot to be learnt here, or to be factored in here, about the political economy of policy making as well, before we can actually really make progress on a lot of these issues. I spent most of today with one of the advisors to Sigmar Gabriel in Germany, and I think the problems there are not dissimilar. Okay, that's biodiversity, big problems. Fisheries, big problems. I don't need to go through all the species, just look at the general shape of those curves. The y-axis is catch per 100 hooks of each of these different species. If you want to add it all up and put it together, a paper in Marine Biology from a few years ago does this very nicely. Looks at the world's fisheries since 1950. It's only 60 years ago, and the proportion that have collapsed or are now overexploited or even fully exploited has risen sharply. It's basically the whole lot. And then, of course, on climate, we're in real trouble. If you haven't seen a chart like this, I would urge you to wake up now, because we have a problem. The problem isn't that we're running out of fossil fuels, it's that we've got too much of them. If you see on the bottom panel here, I've shown the embodied carbon dioxide in reserves and resources of oil, gas in blue, and coal reserves in black. And that's compared with how much of them we can afford to stick up into the atmosphere to keep temperatures at specific levels. So for a best guess 2-degree world, we really can't afford to burn much of what we've got there, and that is before you add in the enormous reserves of coal, resources of coal and lignite. So we have a big peak problem in this space. It's not peak fossil fuels, it's peak atmosphere, and we're running out of it fairly quickly. Okay, and if you thought those concerns were worrying, then think about how they'll be when GDP goes from 70 trillion a year, 7 billion people by $10,000 per person, to 9 billion people with $30,000 per person, a magnification of 4 of those pressures on those resources. So I hope I haven't hammered the point too hard, but what I would like you to take away from part 2 is that business as usual economic growth isn't going to work either. So part 1, zero growth isn't going to work. It's not desirable, it's not necessary, it's probably not even feasible. Part 2, doing what we're doing isn't going to work either. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with this idea, green growth, and it's perhaps unsurprising, therefore, that all of these international institutions and various country governments have adopted it as a bit of a mantra. So what is it? Well, it can just be defined as bog-standard, old-fashioned economic growth that doesn't deplete natural capital. So the green bit is this non-decreasing natural capital piece. You then have to unpack natural capital, of course. It's not great. I mean, it's a very focused idea. It's not including inequality or instability or a bunch of other things that really do matter. And the growth, of course, doesn't include a bunch of things that matter too on the development front. But it's very popular because it suggests that there's no trade-off between these two big features, environmental protection, economic growth, and so energy ministers love it. Going green means going for growth. And you can compare it, contrast it with other concepts like sustainable development, a broader idea on both fronts. Sustainable is broader than green, and development is broader than growth. Low carbon growth is a bit more narrow, and so on and so forth. Given time, I won't encumber you with the tedium of, not that it's not important, but the tedium of definitions. Okay, so what does economic theory tell us, if anything, about the feasibility of green growth? Now, I am aware that for regular audiences, for every equation you put up on your screen, you lose half your audience. So I'm hoping this half don't just walk out of the room at this point. But as I've put up 3, I suppose we need to lose 7/8 of you. But this is not a regular audience, so I figure you can allow me just one slide with some equations. Good-o. So suppose we have a production function. Suppose labour is constant. We ignore that for the minute. It's a function, production output-y is a function of capital, resources, and the natural environmental services that we take away from the atmosphere. So the stock of natural capital, effectively, N. And we've got some equation of motion here where the capital stock evolves, so K dot is the rate of change of capital over time. So it grows according to the equation as output. We take all of our output, we subtract the consumption, we subtract a term that is to do with the cost of extracting our resources, and we subtract a term for the depreciation of capital. And what we've got left is effectively investment, and that enables our capital to grow. And part of growth is increasing your stock of capital of all kinds. And then you've got a second equation of motion, which is the rate of change of the natural environment. So there's some environmental regrowth function. A lot of these environmental assets regenerate themselves for free. We don't have to do anything. And so they regenerate and we extract resources from them. So what this theory tells you, and I'm almost done, is that you can get green growth. All you need is for you to not extract any more than you renew from the environment. So R equals E of N. So just don't take more than the environment's giving you for free. We're doing quite a lot more than that right now. And make sure that you are not consuming more than you can allow yourself to, given what your economy is producing. This is fairly simple stuff. Save, and don't destroy the environment. Okay, so it's perhaps an oversimplification of several decades worth of economic theory, but I just wanted to give it to you in nice and clear fashion. Save, don't destroy the natural environment. Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit more. How would we not destroy the natural environment? How would we save? Well, we need three things here. The theory tells you that you need technological progress to be sufficiently fast, and this is because as you're depleting your exhaustible resources, you need to be having ideas, generating value, etc. in other spaces to compensate for it. You need to be able to substitute clean to dirty. So if a dirty input is absolutely vital for your economic system, then you're sunk. But I don't think it is. And you need to care enough about the future. So again, it's fairly straightforward stuff. So let me dive into some slightly more complicated things before we get into the really messy world of the real world. So a year or two ago, we published a special issue on green growth in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy. We had some great authors, and some of the key findings to emerge from that is that the economics literature tells you that you get the prices right and everything follows, but it's not going to be enough, and it's probably not even going to be feasible in the real world. There's quite a lot of messy government intervention required, and there are trade-offs all around the place. The political economy is messy, but one of the messages to come out is that given the importance of technological progress, a very directed technological push on the clean side for a short period, i.e. 10, 20 years, might do the job without having to agree global regimes on biodiversity or carbon or so on. And to give you a sense of this, little example, again, contestable, but Asia and Africa have both seen 2.5-fold increases in their agricultural output over the last 50-odd years. Asia has done it, so these plots are the same. They show area here and yield here. So that's effectively the productivity of the land. Asia has done it not by increasing the land under cultivation, but by increasing the yield per unit of land. Africa has done it not by increasing the yield, so not major technological change, but simply by extensifying the agricultural sector and increasing the land under cultivation. The point is that there is quite a lot more in the ideas front going into this piece of land, continent, and that's partly through necessity. There wasn't much additional land that they could expand to. And so there's a capability of substituting intellectual ideas here for the use of land. You see it in the chart right there. Okay, so I want to wrap this little piece up by saying what I want you to take away is we've got plenty of resources to use. We're not running out of them. We've got some big problems with our renewable resources, but there's no reason in principle why we can't manage these effectively. And in particular, there's no reason why we can't get our energy systems, which are causing a lot of these problems, under control. We have a vast amount of energy coming in, 5.5 million exajoules per annum to the Earth. We use 500 exajoules for the entirety of human civilization's requirements in a year. We use a fraction of what we could use, and we just need to be smarter about how we harness that incoming energy. And fortunately, there is no bounds upon, well, in theory at least, upon how smart we can be. So, I tried to sum this up in a tweetable quote. I thought the idea of more mind, less matter would do it. I thought, well, that's quite clever. I'm quite pleased with myself. I'll put this into Google and see if anyone else has had the same idea. And I got back, did you mean more mindless matter? Which is the opposite of what I meant, but of course other people had the idea, proving the case that I shouldn't be in PR. Okay, so let's get really messy now and wrap up by thinking about how we, all this theory is nice. Thank you, Cameron. It's good stuff these economists do. But how do we actually change policy to solve the problems? Okay, let me start with a pop quiz, because this frames quite a lot of what I want to say. Hands up, how many of you know anything about climate change? Good, quite a lot. Hands up, how many of you know what net emissions would need to be at steady state to stabilize temperatures at 3 degrees above pre-industrial? So net emissions to stabilize long-run temperatures at 3 degrees above pre-industrial. Any hands? No hands. Have I missed? No, absolutely no hands. Okay. 2 degrees? Anyone know 2 degrees? No? Okay. Yes, we have a hand. Do you want to shout? Yeah, so we do need to stabilize concentrations at somewhere between 450-ish, 500 maybe, parts per million. And what about net emissions going up there? So you're right, not quite the right question though. Well, the answer is 0. And I want everyone, if you forget everything else, cute cartoon here. I realize this is the point at which you think, gee, I'd really rather be having a drink, so I'm giving you some cartoons. But if you remember nothing else from this talk, remember this. If you want to stabilize temperatures at any level, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 5 degrees, 8 degrees, we don't want to go to 8 degrees, but suppose you wanted to go to 8 degrees and stay there. At some point, your emissions need to go to 0. Net emissions need to hit 0. And that's because of some various things that cancel themselves out in terms of ocean circulation and atmospheric. Anyway, I won't go into that. But the point to take away is that the energy system, the entire economic system, doesn't need cuts of emissions by this, that, 20% here, 50% there. It needs to go to 0. So we need a completely radical transformation of the energy system. And that, if you're the arch skeptic who thinks 4 degrees is fine, you are still saying that you want the energy system to be completely decarbonized at some point, just later than those who would aim for 2 degrees. So keep that in mind, because in the minefield of policy making, it's nice to have very simple, clear conclusions that ministers and secretaries of state can remember, and 0 is a number that they can remember. Okay, so the framing on the policy is that we need to bear in mind that these natural capital challenges are huge. Piddling interventions are not going to do it. Sometimes they can be counterproductive. And second, they're long-term, so whatever you do should be enforceable and credible. And being simple actually sometimes helps with enforceability. Okay, now I want to talk about 2 different types of ways of thinking about policy here. You would expect an economist to say, price the externality and be done. In various dimensions, it's fair to say that isn't working. It's hard to get it to work. It may not ever work. The prices aren't quite right. Working in some places, it still should be done where it can be done. But let's think a little bit differently. Yeah, okay, so politicians discussing global warming. They are underwater. And I want to start from this recognition that the first best is a total fantasy. We have recessions, we have infectious diseases and pandemic, unemployment and ISIS and so on. So let's get real. So how do we change the game? The first point is that big international negotiations are less likely to work, quite a lot less likely to work if you're asking nation states to show altruism. It's not that it never happens. It's just that it tends to not get everyone onto the same side of the table. What we need are structures that are club-like, where you actually want to be in the club because being in the club is better for you than being outside the club. Now that might be because someone's giving you lots of things for joining, but it might also be because someone's going to punch you if you don't join. And in the climate context, we need to start using some sticks and some punches as well as some carrots. Second thing you learn from game theory is that the big guys need to go first in a lot of these issues. Third, as I've kind of alluded to, self-interest matters, and lastly, credibility matters. Now, I'm thinking about games, 5 minutes. I'll tell you about a game rather than actually playing a game unless I have a chorus of disapproval. Does anyone want to play a game at this point? There's one hand, two hands. Okay, hands up if you'd like to see a game being played. Okay, that's enough hands. That is more than half. Who wants a drink? Yeah. Unbelievably, there are more hands for the game. I'm sorry, Gordon. Okay, let me skip that game and go to jump very quickly to this game. Okay, so I've got some cards. We're going to play two games. It's not just a boring prisoner's dilemma. I know you've all done that one before. But so I need 5 players. Can you hear me if I shout? Yeah. Right, so the game is up on the board there. I've just given each of these 5 players a red card and a black card. Don't worry, you won't be stressed. I'm not going to sway you or anything. Just relax entirely. The red card means you're going to cooperate with each other. The black card means you're not, effectively. I've just used loaded language and hence biased the whole game. But anyway, you've got some payoffs here. Your payoffs are a function of what the other players play. So let's have a look at them. The payoff to you is in that matrix. It's a function of how many of the other players, so there are 5 players, how many of the other 4 players play red. So if 3 players play red, say, then you get £8 for playing red. You could buy a good bottle of Pinot with that. And £11 for playing black, an even better bottle of Cab Sav or something. And so, you choose to play according to how you think the other players are going to play. All right, we ready? Go. I'm going to collect up the cards. It gets more exciting. She tells me more about you lot than anything else. Goodness me, aren't you nice? This never happens with straightforward economists. We have 4 cooperators and 1 defector. Okay, you've ruined my game. So you're all supposed to defect at this point because the Nash equilibrium is to defect, etc., etc. So that's not the point. I'm setting this up. This is now a bit more fun. Don't stuff me around this time, or I'll be really annoyed. Okay, so this is a different game. This is a coordination game. Oh, this is now. So chuck the other card away. And again, you can play red or black. And again, the payoff is a function of the cards handed in by your co-players, the other 4. Now, I could leave you to analyze this game for yourselves. Maybe I should, but I will. So just have a look at the payoffs here. Have a think about what you get if everyone plays red. What you get if everyone plays, if everyone plays black, 0 red cards. If everyone else plays red, 4 red cards. What you get if you play red or black accordingly. And now, play. You can tell me whether it was worth the 5 minutes of doing the drink. You are still really helpful. Thank you very much. So we have entirely disproving the theory. That's very enjoyable. So in this game, you've got 2 Nash, and it's structured so that it is less efficient than the prisoner's dilemma. The gains, if everyone cooperates, are lower, but in fact, your optimal strategy is to do what everyone else does here. It's a coordination game. You don't want it effect all the time. If everyone else is going to play nicely, you're actually personally better off playing nicely, not just because you feel good. You kill yourself if everyone else is playing fair and you don't. You end up with a lower payoff. And so the idea of this area of research, and there's a fantastic paper by Scott Barrett and Astrid Dannenberg, looking at what happens if instead of just playing these games, people can choose the game that they play. Let's think about that for a moment. So instead of just playing the Kyoto Protocol all the time, imagine if we stepped back and thought, okay, let's spend some time thinking about voting on the actual game that we're going to go and play. Let's reframe it. And so they put people in a multiplayer situation, so that imagine the 5 of you getting together for 20 rounds, and you can choose between playing the prisoner's dilemma and playing the coordination game between each round. And there are various treatments, but I want to show you some of the results. The average payoff here is on the vertical axis. So it goes up from 4-ish to 10. The blue dots are the payoffs obtained by playing the prisoner's dilemma, the first game. The orange dots are those obtained by playing the coordination game. So you can't get a payoff of 10 if you play the coordination game, but you are very reliably going to get payoffs of 8. You can see these little horizontal lines where, okay, we might not have understood the game initially, but we get there and everyone starts coordinating. Whereas in the prisoner's dilemma, cooperation breaks down. You might be nice at the start, but you see that there are these other, even amongst you lot, there are a couple of nasty ones, and you decide that actually you're going to be nasty too, and cooperation breaks down over time. And so the point really of this is that perhaps we should aim for less perfect regimes, where we accept that they're inefficient, but where we find something that's a bit more sticky, where we're trading off a bit of efficiency for something where once everyone's in, we're all locked in together. And I think it's in a sense, a silly little experimental piece, but actually quite profound in what it tells us about how we should be designing these regimes to protect our natural capital. Don't go for the best, think second best, design it so that it's club-like, so that people want to join. They've got an incentive to be in, they don't have an incentive to leave. Okay, let me wrap up. The last idea I want to just share with you is that in a world where you're in the very, very second best of third best of fourth best type worlds, try and find points within the system that are highly leveraged, that are sensitive to intervention, these sensitive intervention points. And in the energy and climate space, given how much energy there is around us everywhere, it's not scarce. You'd think, given how it has military and strategic importance, that energy was this scarce thing, but we are awash with fossil fuels. We've got vast amounts of solar, we've got vast amounts of sun. What we're lacking is the brain to extract it. So where's the sensitive intervention point? Let's stick some cash in the brain and then work out how we can extract a lot of that energy. And just to give you a sense of the scale, here's a map, geography conference after all, so I should stick one up. The small red square could power the entirety of the UK, not just electricity, but also heat and transport. The yellow area could do the whole Middle Eastern, North African area. So you don't need huge amounts of area to actually power the globe. The reason we're not doing it is that it's just a bit too costly because we haven't got our brains sorted. So here's a quote. Could have been said last year. I'd put my money on the sun and solar energy. What a source of power. I hope we don't have to wait until oil and coal run out before we tackle that. Any idea who said that? Thomas Edison in 1931. So it's a bit ahead of his time. Okay, so I'm going to run through very quickly. Tech progress is happening very fast. A lot of it's happening in labs. It is extremely exciting. Quite a lot of it is happening here in Oxford, but there are breakthroughs being made in Berkeley and South Korea and various places around the world with honestly trivial amounts of funding compared to the scale of the challenges that we have in front of us. And much of it holds so much promise because it's about new materials. There are players combining new ideas together. M.Copa are taking on the coal sector and aiming to connect 300 million Indians without access to power through a very clever little device, which if I had more time I'd say more about, but you want to drink. And we've also got the disruptive elements from IT and new consumer propositions happening. So these are some of the sensitive points in the system where I think if you can't get carbon prices, let's aim at that technology. And much of this is really about combining different technologies together to solve the problem. So one of the proposals recently out there which I would support, but which is going to have a bit of its own problems getting up, is the idea of the global Apollo program to support research and development in new energy technologies. Other sensitive intervention points, perhaps the divestment campaign, perhaps finance. All right, so drink time, or at least question time. Let me wrap up. 7 conclusions. First, I've said that no growth isn't necessary, desirable, or feasible to address environmental problems. Dirty growth isn't the answer either. It undermines itself. So in a sense, it's trivial that green growth is required. It means economic growth with the protection or enhancement of natural capital. What are we running out of? We're not running out of fossil fuels. We're not running out of minerals. We've got a superabundance of energy. We may be on the cusp of harnessing it. What we're actually running out of is the natural capital that isn't priced, that doesn't have property rights, that doesn't have markets. And implementing solutions to those sets of problems is very politically tricky. If we could have prices, that would be great, but often we can't. And so the ways of addressing these problems are to be a bit more sneaky, to seek to change the game, to perhaps regulate the nuts and bolts in a different way, and to focus on these sensitive intervention points in the system. So thank you very much. I hope that was interesting.
Okay, we've got plenty of time for questions, and actually I thought I might just leave you to compare your own question time, but perhaps I'll ask the first question. Who has the first? Yeah.
Okay, so the question is, what are the odds of nations actually playing this game? And I'm asking them to do something a lot more complex than what they're trying to do in Paris. So to get into the nitty-gritty, I think actually what the ask is actually something rather more simple than what they're doing in Paris. Paris is a wash with highly differentiated, what are they, intended nationally determined contributions. They differ from country to country. They don't add up to what we need. There is no incentive to ratchet up the ambition other than the hope that there are reputational effects if you don't do what you said you'd do. We've seen how good countries like Canada and Australia respond to reputational effects. They ignore them. They just do what's in their interest. Canada mines its shale. Australia exports its coal. So I'm not saying nothing useful is going to come out of Paris, but I think it is, again, worth taking this step back and thinking about changing the game. So what about this for an idea? We know that coal has to go, unabated coal. We know that the answer is 0 net emissions. How about a standard? No coal. In particular countries at particular times, you could commit to them. It's not efficient. It's not something that necessarily economists would propose, because there'll be cheaper ways of addressing it rather than taking out coal at different points in time. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that either, but I'm saying that there will be a set of much simpler, easy to identify whether players have complied with, easy to monitor type solutions, much harder to enforce. So then the question with that sort of idea is, what do you do to countries who say, yeah, I agree with that, but actually, I'm going to keep burning my coal. And the answer, I think, in a lot of these cases is that to get the club to work, you need some kind of trade sanction, which is another can of worms. So a couple up the front, and then why don't I take these two, and then one more over here, and then we'll come back.
Basically, I think your prisoner's dilemma is drawing an analogy with the trade situation, which is also a prisoner's dilemma. And when that game was played and we got the World Trade Organisation, we got some countries making credible commitments early, particularly Australia. What happened is that it spawned really the whole global production network movement and demonstrated that, and lots of tricking the system to not comply. And that showed really that it was the firms that were the issue, not the states sometimes. And I think the same thing might happen with this prisoner's dilemma, that it's not, the people in the game might not be the right ones.
Yeah, okay. Very, very good point. I'll take another two, but I will, while the mic's moving, I'll just say, I mean, the Montreal Protocol is perhaps an example of what you're saying, where the states get all the credit, but actually the firms were there with the substitute at relatively low cost, so they backed the deal because, you know, DuPont could shift to HFCs, and that's held up as the poster child of a successful environmental deal at the global level. Yeah.
I take your point about the technological dynamism of capitalism and a growth-based economy, but to innovate technically is different from actually implementing, and the implementation of a radical technical transformation implies an equally massive case of moral depreciation, right? Where you're asking large sectors of the economy to give up on fixed sunk capital costs that they have in the current energy systems, housing stock, transportation systems. I don't know if you've given thought to this systematically, but what kinds of institutional frameworks would be needed to deal with the destabilizing implications for markets to have to absorb that kind of change abruptly?
Yeah, that is a super question. The Smith School here at Oxford has a program on stranded assets that looks exactly at this set of questions. What happens to both the asset owners as the assets are stranded? What do they do in advance of that in terms of resisting the stranding of those assets? And it's fairly obvious that you know, the path of least resistance and the least economically damaging path is not to be adding further assets that are going to need to be stranded in due course. Now, at the moment, we've just finished some work here looking at the installed capital stock and the embodied emissions in that capital stock. If you run the existing capital stock down without adding any new dirty capital stock as of tomorrow, you can stick within 2 degrees. In fact, we've got perhaps another decade, perhaps 2, before we are at the point of not being able to add any new dirty capital stock without early stranding of existing capital stock. So in an ideal world, we would not be adding stuff that we're going to have to, that embeds additional political resistance, that embeds, you know, continues institutional power and so on. Now, that's not really a very good answer to your question. I mean, a partial answer is that within the financial system, some of the central banks are starting to think about this. What would happen to stability within the financial system if we had a sudden, abrupt shift in attitudes, in policy, because of a series of extreme events that meant that someone said not just no coal staged over time or no new coal, but no coal at all now. And so that program of work is just beginning. There's no kind of nice, simple answers for you yet. Yeah. Director, do you have? No? Okay. I think there's a whole set over there. Yeah, great.
Yeah, thank you very much for that really interesting talk. And I'm speaking from the German perspective and about that change of politics that you're talking about. I mean, I understand that you think that the Kyoto negotiations don't make any sense or not leading to good results. I mean, that's probably the practical implication of what you said. And I think 2 or 3 years ago, IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, they launched something which they called either Energy Transition Club or Renewable Energy Club. And there were like, I think, 10 countries, including Germany and some others, and they were kind of committing to do more than what, or do something earlier than the Kyoto negotiations are going to do. Is that the type of policy that you would support, and why has it failed so far?
Okay, good question. So just to be clear, I think Kyoto kind of passes a cost-benefit analysis in the sense that, you know, the world is, I mean, Various people disagree with this, but I think the world is better for having it than not having it. But my beef with it is that it's not in any way up to the scale of the challenge. So you can say, you know, spending $1 here gives me $2 back, and say, actually, we need to spend $10 million. So it passes the cost-benefit analysis, is just not what you need. So is a technology agreement more of the sort of thing that we need? Actually, yes, I would say. One of the reasons is that recent research just this year from my colleagues at the LSE, where I still am affiliated, and you know, they have a share of my inbox, that's for sure. Some of their research shows that the spillovers from clean energy are 40% higher than from dirty energy technologies. Now what that tells you is both that there is a strong case for government support of that sort of, you know, of a biased type, because the spillovers mean that private firms are not capturing the benefits, so they'll under-innovate, etc. But it also tells you something else. With emissions, when you reduce your emissions, 99-ish, 8-ish, depending on the country, % of the benefit goes to some other country. That's a bit of a big international spillover or a spill out. If you innovate on the technological side, what I've just said is, well, in fact, the numbers are a slightly different number, but it's, you know, for a big country, around 50% of the benefits flow out to other countries. So you say, well, that's a big spill out, you lose 50% of the benefit. But compared to reducing your emissions, where 90-something% spills out, the spill outs, international spillovers are much lower. And so it's easier to get a deal on R&D than on emissions. Okay, so then to kind of really engage with your question, so what should that deal look like? Why not Irina's deal? Why didn't that work? I think with all of these things, a key element is you know, the dynamics of the game. So what is bringing countries to want to join the club? What might mean that they actually want to leave or stay outside? Is there a big enough set of costs being outside and a big enough set of benefits being inside to make it sticky and ambitious? And so a lot of these previous deals are deals in which there's pretty much no cost to not joining. You know, no one's going to come and punch you if you don't join. This is what I was going back to before. There is some stick element that I think is going to be required. It probably involves the trade regime. If you're not in, you're being hit with some kind of sanction, because carrot alone probably won't do it. So that's a high-level answer to why previous tech deals haven't worked. Okay.
Yes. Well, first of all, it was a really interesting talk.
Thanks.
And I have a question from inside the UN, the climate change negotiations. And I'm a former negotiator of the UN. And the question is, okay, it's really interesting, the idea about cooperation. But what happened in the case, okay, and the idea is based on the big players should cooperate and the rest will follow. So I agree with that. But what will happen with, for example, with the OPEC countries? That they are like big players.
Mm-hmm.
And if you reach a global climate agreement, that means that these countries will have to reduce their oil exports, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But what will happen just if you were like Venezuela or Angola, that, okay, your main source of income will be reduced, but you don't have any other industry. You have a really low diversified economy. And it's so hard to diversify, as you know. So what will happen with them? They will be like the losers in this case. And other thing, well, the idea is that technology, they could help to change this transition. But technology is developed, all the innovation in the world is developed like in the north. I like to say Europe, the US, China. And how do you manage to transfer this technology? And one of the big issues in the climate change negotiations are technology transfer. What you do with intellectual property rights. How do you transfer? How do you don't have to pay huge royalties for accessing to technology? So if I'm in this case, it's really hard that I will cooperate. I don't know if you have thoughts about this a little
Sure,
bit more complex
yeah.
reality.
So if you're a former negotiator, you probably feel like thumping the Saudis, I guess. But the question is definitely a good one. The big guys do need to go first, but unfortunately we can't stop there. So you commonly hear people say, just get the G20 to do it and then you're done. And the G20 will do a lot of it, but what happens is you still get substantial leakage of emissions, the other countries grow, etc. And they become all of the problem. And remember that the number that we need to get to is 0, not 80% cuts or 90% cuts. So you're absolutely right. It has to hit everyone in the end. And I'm afraid it takes me back to, I'm sounding like a bit of a stuck record, but it takes me back to the point, of these clubs. People have to want to come and join. And they are going to want to join when the benefits of being in exceed the benefits of being out. And the benefits of being out, if you're a big oil player, is fairly high. Falling, perhaps, as demand falls because of new technologies. We're not going to, residual demand once you've shifted your energy systems for oil is going to be fairly low, and it'll be just the Saudis making not that much money at $5 or $10 a barrel if their economies haven't already collapsed at that point. So, the challenge is both the carrot to bring them in, but also the stick to say don't join and you're in trouble. And we can't just ignore those countries, and some of them are going to need a lot of assistance as the transition happens. So there's no doubt that there are costs installed for undiversified countries who are heavily reliant upon fossil fuel exports. Venezuela, Russia is not looking all that happy a place right now, if you look forward a couple of years. But the costs of the planet going under are somewhat greater. So it is a matter of just managing that transition. Okay, you have 3 more down the front here.
I think it's great to have a presentation at a conference like this on how the role of resource intensity and environmental intensity in the nature of economy. So thank you for that.
Pleasure.
I do have some questions though, and I think you neatly demonstrated that at least as far as fossil fuels go and renewable resources go, the issue is not stock, it's flux. It's the rate of extraction and the rate of combustion for fossil fuels. But the problem surely is that improvements in economic growth, and particularly improvements in labour productivity over the last 50 years, have depended on the substitution of labour by energy, particularly. Mm-hmm. And that those gains have then therefore depended on accelerating that flux. And the question therefore must be, to what extent is it possible to have those gains in labour productivity going forward, which is central to your thesis, mm-hmm. if we're aiming to reduce that flux? And you can see improvements at the level of individual products. So you see a dematerialisation around particular products. But of course, those gains at the level of units output have been outstripped by the scale of the economy. So that seems to be the weak point always of an environmental economist's argument, is this lack of what a number of years ago Barbier referred to as the existence theorem, which is that link between what level of flux is necessary to sustain growth and at the same time doesn't destroy underpinning ecological services. So I wanted to interrogate that issue around labour productivity and resource flux a little bit more.
Yep, great. So I think your premises are largely fine. The one thing I just want to stress, though, is that it is certainly about the flows over the next decade, but both the climate problem is really a stock problem. And that's why 0 is the number that matters. Once you've hit your, think about the bathtub. The atmospheric stock. So I'm not disagreeing, I'm just making sure that I'm not being unclear. That on the climate and the atmospheric side, we have effectively a fixed stock. The reason we need to get emissions to 0 is because once you're at the stock, any more and you're over the stock. Okay, but to engage kind of directly, absolutely right. Labour productivity has been largely about increased amounts of capital and increased use of energy. For me, the problem isn't the use of energy. For me, the problem is the use of dirty energy. And we've got, as I said, 5.5 million exajoules of clean stuff hitting us that we haven't yet nutted out how to capture. Efficiencies are still very low. they're rocketing up in the labs because people are finally starting to think about it. So imagine for a moment, fast forward 50 years-ish. At that rate, solar is still going down 10% per annum in cost of modules. It's going down in fully installed cost. Batteries are coming down slower, but they're still coming down. You can imagine a system where this is a non-issue economically. Why would you do fossil fuels? It's just more expensive. You do clean because it's cheaper. And at that point, you have a radical acceleration of labour productivity because you've stimulated the economy with a new cheap energy source that is effectively limitless. It's clean and it's largely limitless. You have some supply chain issues in getting your cells up and running, but clever scientists will solve that. They're already working on ensuring that the individual component materials have no limitations on them in the supply chain. So my long-run instinct, I suppose, it's a little bit more than that. It's a data-informed instinct, is that we will have a problem with labour productivity in the short to medium term because, frankly, clean is still more expensive than dirty at the moment. But it's just a question of time. Now, if we don't accelerate it, we might get there in 20 or 30 years, and it'll be too late probably for 2 degrees. But we'll get there in terms of clean energy being cheaper than dirty energy, and then your labour productivity issues are gone. But 30 years is a long time. I may well be dead. So what do we do in the interim is a very, very good question. And it's I think it's about not being stupid about your asset stranding. So installing new clean kit as your old dirty kit retires. Not being stupid about the geographical location where it's installed. If you look at Europe as a whole, we are largely installing stupid things in rather odd places because we don't have an integrated European energy strategy. If you stuck all the solar across Europe in Greece and Italy and you stuck all the wind where it ought to be, I think you save, I can't remember the exact number, but it's hundreds of billions or trillion. So in the midterm, ensuring that we don't hammer labour productivity with higher energy costs is all about ensuring that the renewable energy goes in the sensible places, it is installed at sensible times, and to the extent possible, we accelerate this R&D to bring the costs down faster than they're already coming down. Yeah.
I would like to have you just give a little bit more explanation of your argument about the stick. You mentioned trade sanctions as an example of that, but trade sanctions would be linked to environmental, but trade sanctions, as we can see with what the U.S. government is doing vis-a-vis Russia, potentially as trade sanctions have all kinds of geopolitical, military. How would you avoid that whole big issue of that in terms of the trade sanctions, trying to keep purely environmental when in fact it's going to be impacted by all these other pressures?
Look, it is a very, very good question, and I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers on trade. I realise it's difficult diplomatically, it's difficult economically. Let me just give you a little bit of structure. So there are 2 broad ways of thinking about these. One is that, as Bill Nordhaus has just recently proposed in his paper, I think presidential paper of the American Economic Association, is to use fairly standard trade measures, not link them to the environment. If you're in the club, good for you. If you're out, you're facing generalized tariffs. It would require changes in the law to the WTO rules. But his argument is that it is worth it. The other approach, which I've proposed in the past with Dieter Helm and Giovanni Ruta, is to have your trade sanctions very targeted and just relating to carbon. Now, this has its problems as well. I'm well aware of them. The idea, to be clear, is that if you look at 2 countries, here they are, B and A, trading with each other, and you start very simply and you say, why don't these countries hit each other with tariffs? Well, it's because we have a system whereby if country A were to stick a trade restriction on B, B finds it optimal to retaliate. And as a result of that, B does nothing. So you have a kind of fragile peace because of the threat of retaliation. Now, if you extend that little model, so the model that I just described is in black here, and you add the possibility of what is called a border carbon adjustment, or a tariff that is just on the carbon content of your goods. Then the game theory plays out in it's very, it's overly simple, I'm well aware of that, but so these things occasionally have some insight. If A were to put on a trade restriction, then, suppose B can do nothing or put on a border carbon adjustment in response to A having imposed a border carbon adjustment. If A imposes a border carbon adjustment, B will find it sensible to stick its own adjustment onto carbon exports and take the cash. And so what you get is a set of cascading incentives for countries to be pricing carbon, because if they're not pricing the carbon, another country is pricing the carbon and collecting the rent. Now, early experience with the EU's aviation scheme, which was effectively a kind of implicit application of this, isn't very promising. Right? We had a massive diplomatic row. The EU ultimately backed down. It's going to come up again. The policy is going to go live again in the next 12 months. I suspect the EU will back down again. That'll be that. And an unfortunate lesson from that would be these things don't work. The lesson I take from it is if you want to get a fairly weak multi-nation grouping that doesn't have much spine to stick one of these things on, is not going to work. Try the US in that position, and okay, you've got some very interesting consequences that might flow from it, but you've got a much better prospect of this actually sticking, and other countries saying, okay, well look, the US is doing it, we are going to do it too. And the reason I like this is because it has club-like properties. Right? If someone else is doing it, you want to do it too. And that's what you want, so that you get a cascading set of actions and everyone joins in, and actually then pricing carbon is something you want to do. It's not something that costs you, it's something you wish to do. So, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So, thank you very much, Cameron, for the lecture. I must say, I also think that technological change and investment in change over the longer term is a fundamental ingredient in success. I also stand by the argument that economic growth is fundamental to making that work. It has to be clean economic growth, and it must be clean energy. And I think it's very interesting when you talk to major corporations about this question. They talk about, well, what would be the source of energy? So they're thinking, not are we have no choice of energy. They're thinking, well, what's the pathway to the future? They're already thinking future on the clean energy side. And they're also thinking technology, because they themselves want to be sustainable in the sense of zero net additional contribution bad to the environment. And how do you do that except invest in your own productive activity and the technology by which you make things and distribute things around the world? Which is not to say it's simple. I'm startled by Cameron seduces us with the second best, the simple, and then proceeds to basically give us a geopolitical blueprint for the future, which is going to take a little bit, I'm sure we agree, but in that sense, he's taken us from what's possible and provided us, if you like, actually what we ought to do as humanity, which may not be near as possible, but in that not near as possible, there are going to be people who join clubs, people who stay out of clubs, and actually as long as we have clubs being formed, that might be just enough to make a difference. So thank you very much, Cameron. And someone said that there are drinks, but before that, a round of applause.